All right, hello, and welcome to the session on how the News on Wiki campaign links information in newspapers, Wikipedia, and search engine results to counter misinformation. Some quick administrative notes before we start. Please respect the code of conduct. You can see the link on the slide here, or you can find it on a conference website. If you're having technical issues, you can send me a message or send a message through the tech support channel in Slack, and someone will help you out as best they can. If you have questions, the Q&A would be an easier method to manage those questions, but if questions come up in chat, we'll try to pass them along. So now for the introductions. The News on Wiki campaign provides information about what media we can trust to readers and media audiences where they're already looking in web searches and on Wikipedia by writing and improving Wikipedia and Wikidata content. Today's speakers will be Pete Forsyth, who is a Wikipedia expert, adept in the collaborative processes that have produced the world's most extensive and most widely read body of knowledge. He helps organizations engage with Wikipedia to achieve their goals while honoring the core policies and values of the site. Sherry Antoine is the executive director of AfroCrowd.org, an international outreach initiative and Wikimedia user group based in New York. AfroCrowd is committed to closing diversity and gender gaps in content and editorship regarding people of African descent on Wikipedia and online. Sherry is also a director on the board of the Internet Society of New York, dedicated to open access and the evolution of the global internet. And Kristy Roschke. Kristy is a media scholar and educator. She's the managing director of Cronkite's News Co Lab, a national leader in advancing media literacy through journalism, education, and technology. And the session will be moderated by Ahmed Median. Ahmed is a project manager in the credibility space. He works with Hacks Hackers, a US nonprofit and founder of initiatives such as the Credibility Coalition and the Wiki Credibility Initiative. And with that, I'll let them take it away.
Thank you, Joe, and welcome to everyone. To start our panel, I'm just going to give a very small presentation about the Wiki Credibility Initiative, which funded the News on Wiki campaign, so that everyone is sort of on board with us. So bear with me. Wiki Credibility is one initiative of Hacks Hackers. Hacks Hackers is a nonprofit in the US. We do many projects on credibility and the understanding of misinformation. Another flagship project of Hacks Hackers is the Credibility Coalition in partnership with Midan, Global Voices, and other organizations, which is basically community professionals who work on understanding misinformation, research, policy professionals, and technologists. And recently, we've been collaborating more with Wikimedians and Wiki communities throughout the world. Also, we launched this WikiCred Grants Initiative, basically to fund projects that focus on credibility and knowledge reliability on Wikipedia, Wikidata, and other wiki projects. So, like I said, this is a very brief about us. Basically, the project started at Wiki Conference North America 2019, which was sponsored by the Credibility Coalition. It was an opportunity to not just have all the Wikimedians in one room, but we also brought people from big platforms and other participants in the larger information ecosystem to talk about credibility on the internet. Our mission has been to support research and projects, software projects, some other events with Wikimedians that focus primarily on credibility. Some of our projects, I'm not going to go through all of them. There are 14 that we funded last year. I'll point out to some links where you can find out more about these projects. But some of our projects basically are APIs. We have one API, developer developed an API with the perennial sources, for instance, on Wikipedia. We have other projects that are, for instance, research projects, understanding of the inclusion of reliability guidelines, for instance, on Wikipedia, understanding what a UX of credibility of Wikipedia looks like, for instance, on a platform like YouTube. These are some of the stats that we have from our campaign so far since last year. So we received overall 38 applications. We've accepted 14 of them, and we've funded projects at an average grant money of $7,000. More details here. These are fairly simple, and I will put the links in the chat. So if you go to wikicred.org, basically you will find a lot of the information that I said. If you go to Misinfocon, which is the blog platform of the Credibility Coalition and Hacks Hackers, you will find a tab with WikiCred and a lot more in-depth information about each and every project that we funded since last year. And you can also go to YouTube if you just Google or use any search engine of your choice. WikiCred and YouTube, you'll find all of our past presentations there. There's almost a monthly event that we started so far called the WikiCred Demo Hour, which is an hour basically where we invite Wikimedians and other professionals to present their projects on credibility on open knowledge platforms. Primarily, it has been Wikipedia and Wikimedia. This has been basically monthly events so far, but now we've moved to an on-demand webinar format. I'll also put in the link if you want to subscribe to receive these webinars. And we're also hosted by the Credibility Coalition. If you'd like to join the Credibility Coalition Slack workspace, I put down the email address of my colleague. You can reach out to them. Yeah, and finally, these are, so while the funding for WikiCred, like basically the majority of it was last year, we're still working on topics to continue the conversation about credibility on Wikipedia. So basically, we're still trying to work on that. We're trying to align, basically, create alignment between subject matter expertise and Wikimedians. One of these projects has been our vaccine safety wiki editathons, where we're bringing together expert Wikimedians and basically people from the professionals from the medical industry to add content to target specifically some content, some pages where we think we should add more content for readers. We're having conversation with some of the platforms about credibility signals. What does that look like? We're also want to continue to build on our model of creating these communities online, establish helplines, hotlines for people to exchange more expertise. Yeah, if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A. I'll answer them. But now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce, I mean, a panel has been introduced, but I'd like to give the floor to them. So Peter and Cherry have worked since last year on the News on Wiki Now campaign. Pete and Cherry, welcome. Can you tell us a little bit about this campaign?
Yes, and thank you so much. It's been so wonderful being able to connect and work with you, Ahmed, through this campaign and through all that you all are doing. There's a lot of exciting things happening in this area, in the Wiki community, and News on Wiki, which is our campaign, is actually in its second phase. It started in 2018, but this cycle, which began in 2020, in the midst of the pandemic, I might add, has gone on until about into the spring. And News on Wiki campaign aims to help the public access factual information about the community news outlets to better inform their assessment of what they can and can't trust, right? It's been found that people in North America especially don't trust the news in the way that has been previously taken for granted. And so what we aim to do is to improve information in the places where people already seek out that information. On Wikipedia, which is the 5th most visited website in the world and a top source for what we provide, and by extension on the many platforms like Google, Facebook, and Bing that highlight Wikipedia content, we work with the public in that flow of information, and we work with Wikipedia editing communities to document both historical and current newspapers to improve what the public knows about these sources, to help them not only discover sources, but also make educated decisions on their credibility. So it's great to see you all. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm going to pass it over to our News and Wiki co-organizer, Pete Forsyth. Pete, please tell the people more. Pete, we can't hear you, so please unmute yourself.
Okay, sorry about that. Moving mute buttons in Zoom. I'm with you. Pete, organizer, Forsyth, reporting for duty. So here's an example of the kind of content that really drives what we do with News on Wiki. So here we have search engine results from Google and DuckDuckGo on local newspapers. And as you see, the part circled in red is an info box that's generated by the search engine. But where does that information come from? That information is generally pulled from Wikipedia. It's pulled, it's pulled from a number of sources on the internet, but the core one really is Wikipedia, and increasingly from Wikidata. So we are really leveraging that that sort of fundamental piece of the internet's architecture to improve information where people are already looking, on the search engines that people are already looking on. Wikipedia and Wikidata are really central places that we can edit, we can change, we can update and improve, that will actually influence the entire internet. As kind of a general overview of what we've done in the last year, we focused specifically on Washington State, on Black-owned newspapers, and on the Caribbean. And as Sherry was saying, our goal is really to improve Wikipedia articles and Wikidata entries in a way that will have a broad impact. And this is our actual mission page, and we we really do focus on the search engine result pages and the info boxes. Sherry?
All right. So in our second phase, which I mentioned before, this began in 2018, where it was sort of an all-encompassing view of North American newspapers. In this phase, we focused on building the infrastructure, incorporating lessons from the previous campaign to help narrow our focus on the three areas that Pete mentioned. News on Wiki brings reliable information about newspapers to readers, as Pete mentioned, where they already look in the info boxes and so forth. If we can just hold on 1 second, let me just finish mentioning, and I think it's important to note that we narrowed our focus to three areas that Pete mentioned: Washington State, which helped us to focus on the local news, in a state-based view, a demographic focus, which focused on Black-owned newspapers, and a regional focus. In this case, it was small island countries in the Caribbean and also in the diaspora. So for our pre-launch events, we opened a Publishing Fest webinar, and we also worked on a Juneteenth Civil Rights Wikipedia Conference, in this case with my group AfroCrowd. And then from there, we were able to just start building a base of a community to work with, to share what we're doing, and also prepare volunteers for the kinds of things that we're trying to achieve through this campaign.
Okay.
If we can have the next slide, please.
Yep. Should be coming up. Is the next slide coming up here? So here we have several of the kinds of events that we did during the campaign. So we started off with a webinar that featured librarians. We had a librarian from the University of Virginia and a librarian from Vermont who are, and that's Molly Schwartzberg and Jessamine West, for those of you who may know them, who are both very experienced Wikipedia editors, but also were really able to focus on the kind of list making that's really crucial to a campaign like this. So we really need two kinds of lists to pull something like this off. We need a list of the content that is missing from Wikipedia, so all the newspapers that don't yet have a Wikipedia article, or the newspapers whose article is kind of incomplete and needs to be added to. And then on the other hand, we need a list of reference materials that we can use as a basis for writing good Wikipedia articles. So we began with a webinar where they really went into some excellent detail on newspapers that they're familiar with, on projects that they've worked on around this area, and really got us off to a strong start. And then from there, we ran a bunch of participatory workshops in which we guided both new and inexperienced Wikipedia and Wikidata editors in how to create and improve new content.
And so some of the presentations and workshops we were able to do really brought in a wider expanse of people than we even expected, because of not only the material, but also the interest in learning more about what to do with this kind of information on Wiki. Some of the Wikipedia articles that were produced out of this focused on Atlanta Voice, the Birmingham Times, and these are Black-owned newspapers, the Black Lens, which is based in Spokane, Washington, and a few of the others that you see here. Another that can be mentioned is that not all these papers were necessarily, for example, more recent newspapers. Some of them were very historic newspapers that didn't have information or much information on the site. So Pete, if you can talk about some of these samples that we're looking at right now.
So yeah, so here are just a couple of the examples, just to give you an idea of the depth that we were working at. We were basically focused on doing pretty short articles that give you the basic critical information. And if you see here on the right-hand side on the Atlanta Voice article, this info box is one of the main places that Google and other search engines will pull from in generating those info boxes on the search engine results page.
And something that I mentioned before was that we found more people interested in what we were doing than originally our focus when we kind of were dreaming this up for. Librarians are already a key part of Wikipedia, the Wiki community. We love librarians. I'll say it again, we really love librarians. And one of the reasons is because librarians are sort of, they are, what's the word? If knowledge is power, then they are the warriors. They have the knowledge of where the information is, and also can be very aware of how important information can be in our understanding of knowledge. So that is one of the key groups that we work with. But there are also other great groups that we work with, including professors, students, community members. We also had a group of journalists who were interested. So in as far as just learning what we were doing. So there's a lot of ways that this can be used and worked with.
So we did work. Yep. Oh, we worked specifically with a couple of university professors, and of course we do have Kristy Roschke with us here today. So we're going to be able to go into some detail about how her students were able to participate in this campaign, generate content for Wikipedia as part of their learning about how online information fits together. And just as a sort of a a quick taste of what the Wikidata aspect of the work that we did can power. These maps are something that were generated actually originally in the 2018 campaign. Actually, an Australian Wikimedian named Toby Hudson generated the first iteration of this map, which shows you a dot for every newspaper that Wikidata is aware of. And if it's green or yellow in this example, that means that there's a Wikipedia article. And if it's red, that means there isn't one. And so we're able to measure our progress using graphics like this. But also, I think it's important to think about how, when these kinds of tools, as they get better, they're going to be available and accessible to all kinds of professionals, to journalists who are telling stories about the data that's, where the data that's in Wikipedia and Wikidata can inform any number of news stories, or professors, people in any number of professions. So by building content in Wiki, we're actually feeding sort of the underpinnings of graphics like this, and we'll be able to kind of influence the way stories are told all over the world. And just to wrap it up with an example of the kind of Wikidata entry that we're producing, I know at this conference there are many sessions on Wikidata, so I think that it's pretty well understood by this audience. But this is this is the structured information that also can drive the kinds of info boxes that we've been talking about. So just by getting like 3 or 4 of these pieces of information is enough to get something on the map like this, is to generate a dot. And then also linking other databases like the Library of Congress and various library databases really helps to ensure that all the information that's known about a local newspaper in all the disparate places on the internet is kind of glued together. So that's really all I have for the slideshow. And I think, Ahmed, you have some questions for us.
Thank you, Pete. Jerry, for me, I'm always reminded of the importance of some work like this. Whenever I read about like a historical event or something that happens like every day, media is typically your first-hand source to what is happening. And it's really important if you're interested about the sources of information where you're reading your news or, about history, it's important to go and see like, well, what was the history of this newspaper? Or if people are trying to make up basically misinformation or information on newspaper that did not exist, it's important to ascertain like the historicity of these newspapers. I have some questions for you, mainly because you both are organizers and you work with volunteers. What do you think, and I'm assuming a lot of our attendees are also organizers and work in campaigns. What are in your opinion, the challenging aspects or the positive aspects of attracting new audiences, new editors to care about these type of projects and to contribute and add knowledge to campaigns like these?
If I can jump in, Pete?
Please.
I really think that's a great question, because I think a lot of the ways that the public sees Wikipedia is very pixelated, if you will. So, they go to this website, there's information, and then they leave. But I don't think for many people, they realize the depth of the community behind Wikipedia, and that I think it's also in many ways a forgotten art, that you can edit Wikipedia, and that you can also, add, sources and other kinds of information. So that's part of what this campaign was about, was to bring it to the public. We definitely wanted to work with Wikipedians, people who had already established themselves as Wikipedians, because of the kind of work that we were trying to do. But also, it was very important to reach out, for example, to students, like we did with, for example, Kristy's classes, as well as connect with, we had an editathon on Black-owned newspapers, for example, with members of the community who were interested in, not just Black history, but the telling of Black history and sharing of community knowledge. We also connected with Wikimedians of the Caribbean, which is another user group in Wikipedia that I'm help lead, that focuses on information concerning the Caribbean. And the reason that these kinds of groups are important is because they're the ones who are going to be interested in making sure that not only is the information reliable and credible, but it also that there's representation. Smaller local newspapers, for example, can often be overshadowed by the better known papers or information sources, like, let's say, a New York Times or a Guardian or the Post or something like that. And sometimes in whether it's in a local community or in even a smaller country, those that information can be covered over by news sources that, for example, editors already trust and know. So one thing that this project helps to do is not only make it more relevant to the people, bringing the information to communities that find it more relevant, excuse me, that find it more relevant, but also to make it easier for editors to learn information about papers that perhaps were overlooked because they were missing some of the details that help editors on Wikipedia and Wikidata, et cetera, see that source as reliable and verified. So it's sort of an in-between step.
So Ahmed, I think another aspect of this is that, well, as Sherry was saying, going to existing groups is a really important way to draw people into Wikipedia. And one of the best approaches that we found to that was working with professors in assigning their students work. So I'd love to hear from Kristy about what it was that drew her to work with this project and how her students benefited from it.
Sure, I'm glad to share a little bit of insight. And so I really want to just repeat what Sherry said about what people know about Wikipedia being pixelated. I just love that that's so great. And I'm going to use that and give you credit, of course, Sherry. But I feel like that media literacy is all about the way that we engage with media and information. And I think that the way we've been teaching media literacy and information literacy has been a bit pixelated. So we help people discover information kind of in a ecosystem that doesn't exist in that way, and so most people don't have a very good understanding of the policies, practices, technology that underlie the places we get information. It's at hand all the time, and we just accept the fact that we can find any information we need on our phones at the moment that we need it, but we don't really understand how that came to be. And I think Pete and Sherry have already done a really great job of discussing the different ways that News on Wiki brings together community and really underscores how, as a collaborative community, Wikipedia can work. And as a journalism professor, it's really important for my students to understand that having newspapers having a strong presence in Wikipedia really helps strengthen journalism and how credible we find journalism to be. So when I learned about this project last year, 2019, maybe it was at the end of the year, I was so excited because there's just so many different layers related to not only the technology and the platform and the research that the students needed to do to find the information about the newspapers, but also there's this meta narrative about the importance of newspapers being perceived as credible and Wikipedia being able to help establish that credibility. So like all of these many layers, I had been teaching with Wikipedia for several years in a much more, sort of random way. And this project really allowed me to gel and give a focus and to work with a community that already existed and have the students be part of that community. So it's just been this very rich community on so many levels, or experience on so many levels.
Thanks, Kristy. Can you tell us a bit more, and the audience as well, how you used Wikipedia to teach digital media literacy to your students?
Sure. So, as I was saying, part of being media literate is understanding not only how to interact with information and how to know what it is that we're looking for when we're seeking out news or other types of information, but it's really about how it is created and who's involved in the creation. And particularly, in a digital society where so much of that creation is ostensibly very democratic, right? We all can do it if we choose to. And yet I'm sure it's, you've all heard, well, Wikipedia is not credible because anybody can edit it. And what I've been able to do in my classes, and what I love about being able to teach us in media literacy, is to really turn that around and say that's exactly why we should use Wikipedia, because anyone can contribute to it. And these are the conversations that have been going on in the discourse with experienced editors for 20 years of Wikipedia. They've the system down pat, and introducing them to this extensive system of collaborators, which is really overwhelming for them at first, because they're like, I had no idea there was so much involved in editing Wikipedia. So just helping them to understand why Wikipedia is such a rich place to find information, why they can use it in their studies, and how, and then again, even going further into how to find quality secondary sources to create a Wikipedia entry. It's really, it's really nothing short of mind-blowing for many of my students to have this experience. And so even those who don't end up actually editing on Wikipedia, it's kind of a range. Some of them will make some edits, some will make a whole page. Pete showed an example of one of my students who started a page for News on Wiki. Some of them just do background research, but all of them come away with a deep understanding, not only of Wikipedia, but just how knowledge is created in today's environment, how they can play a role in it, how they need to play a role in it. And so that's kind of what I love so much about using Wikipedia as an example of that.
Yeah, I think that really touches on an important point, which is that, from a formal or an informal educational perspective, research is a really fast evolving area. So in a way, like learning Wikipedia skills is not specific to Wikipedia. It really overlaps with how do you dig into a topic and really learn, learn good, find good source material, really find accurate information about it. So, for example, with, you have like on the one hand, you have like a traditional approach to research that would be very heavily guided by libraries and traditional knowledge institutions. On the other hand, you have a Google or Bing search, which is how most people do research these days. But there's really a very rich area, sort of in between and combining these. So for example, like local newspapers, it's often very difficult to find information where another credible source has said something about a local newspaper so that we know what to say about it on Wikipedia. And some of the places that we would draw from, like you might find something on a Google search. Someone in the questions mentioned the Library of Congress's Chronicling America project, which is certainly valuable. That's something that comes up in a Google search. But there are lots of sources that don't. So for example, you might log into your local public library or your university library and have access through that to the Newsbank database, which is not going to come up in a Google search, right? You have to log in to get access to that database to get lots and lots of newspaper articles where they might talk about other newspapers, where maybe like the big newspaper in a town mentions a story that was broken by a community paper or something like that. Or you might have to buy a subscription to newspapers.com to get other newspapers that aren't included in the Newsbank database. Or you may actually need to track down a book about the history of newspapers in your state or the history of Black-owned newspapers to get that kind of information. So, I think so. Kristy's students and really all of us who work with Wikipedia are continually learning sort of new tricks for how to find good information that you don't necessarily pick up if you're just treating Google as your entry point, or even if you're just using a library as your entry point.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, Pete, just quickly, I think what you said at the start of this is this experience is very transferable for my students, and so they're doing this research and it's accessible. So they're doing this research for a purpose that they feel connected to, which makes them want to do it more. And as anything is, when you're teaching, you always want to sort of make it what they know. And so Wikipedia is sort of a bridge between Google and these institutional libraries that are a little bit harder to access, maybe they're getting to be able to make accessible information. And, we're really in a place of privilege being in an academic institution. My students do have access to a lot of sources that most people do not. So as a class project, we're really able to help because we can access Newsbank and other databases that we have subscriptions to in the university, but a lot of the groups that Sherry and Pete work with don't necessarily have access to. So we can take this information, turn it into a Wikipedia page, and then give it to other people who aren't going to be able to use our library. And also our students never use our library, which is terrible, but that's just kind of how it is. They want to Google everything. So this is it gives them a great reason to use those resources that are so expensive and behind these paywalls.
Yeah, it would be great for
Sorry.
It'd be great for more newspapers also to make information about their history more openly available to the public, because that makes it easier for editors and others to find that information, and which helps to get to the answers of credibility. So things like, what's your circulation? How long have you been around? What kind of awards have you won? That kind of a thing. That helps to establish that as well.
I like the word Jerry mentioned earlier, information warrior, which is like what we hope people become from just consumers to basically maybe content creators and information warriors. I have a question for you, Kristy. You're an educator, and here we think of Wikipedia as not just one platform for information, but rather an ecosystem of information. There are new platforms that emerge every day with their own bad information ecosystems. How do you think educators can act in this space to help students and maybe even the public use Wikipedia and the ecosystem that comes with the entire Wiki universe? I would say to sort of equip themselves like with tools and with knowledge and how to not just be readers, but also contribute maybe to the information ecosystem, remedy some of the misinformation that goes on.
Sure, that's a great question, and it can certainly feel overwhelming. I mean, it's overwhelming for all of us as an educator to try to keep up with all the new platforms and technology. And it's like if you work, especially if you're like in journalism or communication, and you're trying to teach people how to responsibly use social media, and then a new social media platform blows up and you're like, okay, now I have to relearn sort of how to teach these things. And so I kind of look at things as you have norms and practices for online communities. And again, this goes back to why Wikipedia is such a great tool to use, because it is sort of the old guard at this point, right? 20 years of history and practices and discourse and communities have created this way of doing things that's constantly evolving, but also fairly stable when you compare it to other new technologies that might introduce my students to. I think back to what I was teaching in 2012, let's say, I'm like, half of those sites don't exist anymore, So if I'm really sticking to the latest technology, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. What makes more sense is to think about the norms and those enduring practices that aren't really going to change regardless of the platform. And if you can help students understand the positive norms, right? So if we can highlight the ways that communities can be great and how they can contribute and be these positive forces for knowledge sharing, and it can impart those practices to them, then they can adopt them to new platforms. They're much more adept at new technology than I am at this point. So if I can give them those underlying values and norms and help them connect with community in positive ways, that's a great step toward fighting misinformation, in my opinion, so they can help others understand, well, this is why when I'm looking at something on this site, these are the things I'm going to look for that are going to tell me whether or not I should believe it or not. And let me, here's an example that I can share from my experience working with Wikipedia. So so I think it can feel very overwhelming for educators to think they have to keep up with the times, but there really is a lot that stays the same, just as everything is changing at the same time. So
yeah. I think, your point about that Wikipedia with its 20-year history, it has a kind of stability that you don't get from other platforms, I think is a really important one. And I think it, it connects with, like, Wikipedia, of the top web platforms, Wikipedia is the only one that is community and nonprofit driven. You hear a lot of talk about community in relation to Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, but ultimately those are platforms that are driven for a profit. Right, their ultimate goal is not necessarily to build community, and so you also see lots of controversies coming up around the kinds of social impacts that they have. So they have to go back and sort of retrofit, well, how are we going to deal with the spread of misinformation? How are we going to deal with harassment? Those issues, of course, exist in Wikipedia as well. But with Wikipedia, from the very beginning, it's been about how can we do something together, not just about how can we get to know each other, how can we chat with each other, but how can we do something that's focused on building agreement, building consensus around what the facts of the world are. It's the fundamental purpose of Wikipedia. So it's sort of no accident that when you talk about social norms, that Wikipedia has been one that's actually been kind of documenting and trying to take a deliberate approach to those from the very beginning, as opposed to sort of trying to come back, 10, 15 years into the project and say, oh, we got some problems, I guess we're going to have to come up with some standards.
And it's not perfect. No, just as nowhere is perfect. Right. We're still dealing with things like representation and marginalized communities and how their voice gets heard. But it's one of those communities that, because of its history and because of its communal nature, people talk this out, and we are actively trying to work on those issues. Whereas a lot of times those can either get glazed over and never addressed at all.
Thank you. I have one last question for everyone before we move to the Q&A, and you could ask your questions there. This is something that you just really touched upon right now. Wikipedia is not just perhaps putting in information or reliable citations. It's more of a community where people learn how to interact with each other. So there are all of these spaces, the talk pages. People talk about how you should address reliability of one source, or what is notable, what goes into certain even controversial topics like COVID origin. Pete, can you tell us a little bit about the benefits of really working with that within that space, learning how to sort of even work with information that opinions that might not be that you might not agree with, or other perhaps relying on sources that you might not be your go-to sources, as a personal choice. And that's a question for everyone.
Well, I think maybe to sort of kick that one off, Wikipedia. I think Wikipedia has always taken an interest in the quality of the sources that are used to justify its articles. So the standards tend to be fairly traditional in the sense that you want to be using sources that are either academic, or they come from a news organization that has an editorial structure where it's not just one person sharing their opinion, but that it's there's some vetting and some consideration, and maybe the publication has a track record of issuing corrections if they when they do have missteps. Things, sort of markers like that. Now, I know another one of the Credibility Coalition grantees, the Art and Feminism Project, just recently released a really excellent report that is critical of Wikipedia's approach to that. But I think I would really emphasize that at least Wikipedia has made an effort to go in that direction. There may be a lot further to go to kind of make that definition of reliability more rigorous and more equitable. But there is a decent foundation to it. So that's the kind of thing, that's really the core of how disagreements get resolved in Wikipedia is, if we've got two people with very different political views working on an article, the thing that is supposed to kind of, resolve that dispute is finding reliable source materials that can kind of place those differing views in context. And ideally, in most cases, you'll come up with like a paragraph that describes what the differing views are and sort of how they relate to each other, rather than trying to tell the reader like which is the correct one of the views. So that's often a role that Wikipedia can play is kind of giving people a framework to understand the different opinions that they encounter online, as opposed to trying to adjudicate which one is correct or incorrect.
And more can be done to make the space can be very intimidating for a lot of people, especially if there is a dispute. And more can definitely be done in that area, so that when there is a dispute, those who want want an equitable response will feel that there is space for that, and that it's not always majority that's going to crush the lowly editor, but again, that's an area where more work can be done. But the positive part is that more eyes are on, okay, how can this be done, and how can we get to a better place, so that different views and so forth, there'll be space for more people to enter that fray. So it's a work in progress. It's a living organism. I like to think of this kind of global experiment that is Wikipedia and the wiki community and all the different projects as a living organism that's constantly changing and growing, and hopefully getting closer to best. So
I think
that's the positive part about it.
I remember at the conference we met at, Sherry, the Wiki Conference North America, Gardner Campbell was a professor, I believe from Virginia, had a presentation where he had what I thought was a fantastic perspective on it, which was that he described Wikipedia as a city whose chief export is an encyclopedia. So if you just think of it as an encyclopedia, you're really missing a whole lot of the the activity that underlies the production of that encyclopedia. And there's a lot of value beside actually I think there was a passing mention earlier. I think Ahmed, maybe or someone mentioned the perennial sources page on Wikipedia, which I think people may not know what that is. It's not part of the encyclopedia. It's one of the sort of under the hood pages, which is a public page. Anyone can access it, but it's not considered part of the corpus of Wikipedia. It's more of a how we think things through, how we deal with if someone says the Daily Mail, should we or shouldn't we use that as a source for Wikipedia articles, or the New York Times or CNN or whatever it is, there have been discussions in the past about what are the things that tend to make that source reliable and tend to make it unreliable. Maybe in some cases it might be like, well, this is something we'd like to consider a reliable source when it comes to general news and entertainment issues, but when it comes to politics, they have a clear bias throughout their history. People have talked through those things and discussed them. And so there's a page on Wikipedia that captures and summarizes those discussions. And even though that's not presented as a Wikipedia page, it's something that we would consider original research, which Wikipedia is not really there to present to the public. But it can be really useful to other people who are interested in that question. And I'll put a link in the chat to that page to give a sense of what that is. I want to emphasize too, we're into the time that we have set aside for Q&A, and we've had a couple of really good questions come in, but we certainly have room for more. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A function.
Yes, there was an earlier question that I'd just like to acknowledge for you, Pete and Cherry, and if you intend to continue to work with librarians and serial librarians, particularly at the LAA in the future.
Sherry? I think go ahead.
So the ALA is and other groups that are focused on librarians, so librarian associations we would love to work with groups like that. And again, because of not only their a relationship with information, but knowledge of kinds of information that can be used and their importance and the reason why they're important. I know that in the past, I've personally worked with AfriCrowd and other groups with the ALA, and it's been fantastic, as well as the Black Librarians Association, other librarian associations. So that's definitely another area to look at as well going forward. But Pete, go ahead.
Yeah, I really nothing to add there. It's we have worked with some organizations. We have not really had a really specific contact with that particular group, but this is a growing campaign that we always are looking for good connections. So.
And I should mention, we did we wanted to do more with the Caribbean, and I think that's the next layer to unravel, because there's so much that can be done there. But I think we also ran out of time. But it's definitely an area that has a lot of growth potential, and we've been able to connect with librarians in that context as well, online digital libraries and so forth. So yeah, we would love to hear more. If you have more information or more groups that you think we can connect with, please include them in the chat, and we'd love to connect.
And another question in the Q&A, well, it was in the chat, but how do you think communities can work with bad faith, effort to manipulate sort of these Google search engine research?
Yeah, that's a really insightful question. I think so. Yes, like what we're doing here, we like to think that that we have a good opportunity to influence what people find online, and we like to think that we're using that power for good, that we are helping people better understand the quality news outlets in their community and being able to distinguish them from ones that might be more bad faith or likewise. But I think the question is getting at like those same techniques. Certainly people try to use these same kinds of techniques to advance an agenda that we might not think of as beneficial. So examples would be, companies trying to write their own Wikipedia entry and gloss over controversies or market their products, or political campaigns trying to shape the narrative around a certain political topic. So there's all kinds of activities like that. And to a certain degree, I think Wikipedia by its structure is fairly resilient to that, because there is that strong emphasis on making sure that we are relying on good sources, and there, when someone disagrees with something, there will typically be some discussion around that, and some kind of conclusion will be reached. Content may be removed or improved, but of course, in practice, that works better on some articles and in some topics than others. So as readers, it's really important that we have an understanding of how Wikipedia works, and be able to kind of draw our own conclusions. So you might sort of come to the, if you're interested in biology, you might develop a sense that the articles about biology on Wikipedia tend to be pretty accurate, tend to be pretty rooted in science, but that you might not want to look at Wikipedia as your only source about local politics, where the reality might be that just one or two people are writing most of the Wikipedia content, and they might be bringing their political perspective into it intentionally or unintentionally, and that might really be coloring it. So you might not want to go to Wikipedia at the exclusion of finding trustworthy local news sources to inform yourself on those kinds of topics.
Well, and if I can just jump in really quickly on that point, which is, in addition to the general public understanding how Wikipedia works better, it's also, I think, imperative that news organizations begin to understand the importance of having a presence on Wikipedia, which I think they've been very, very slow to understand. And local news in particular is especially susceptible to being, gamed in the misinformation game. So there are lots of ostensibly local news digital publications popping up that really aren't news organizations, but they look and sound like they are, but really they are either, supported by political PACs, or they're just completely made up sites. You've probably heard of this like network of pink slime websites, they call them, that pretend to be news, local news, but really are just partisan misinformation. And if the actual local news sites don't have a presence on Wikipedia, so the absence of having a presence is the same as like not having credibility. If someone's trying to find out, well, I'm seeing this article from this place called, the Daily Tribune, and I've never heard of it before because it's not from my local town. I want to find out if this is a source I can trust. If I search the Daily Tribune and I don't find it, it doesn't come up in an info box right away, I'm going to be suspicious of the site. And it may not be warranted. So part of what, the work that I'm doing with my students is to try to change that. And now I'm realizing I need to do more work with my news organization partners to, so that we can boost those profiles for them as well. And they can see the value in that.
Kristy, there's another question for you from the audience, specifically about the students. Which year or semester here in the question?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I work with undergrads, and it's kind of a mixed bag, but most of them are upperclassmen. So it's a 400 level class. So usually I'm getting juniors and seniors, but so they've been in other college classes before and have had some, I would hope, some, experience researching at the college level. But even then, many of them, I mean, this is the first time almost all of them have ever done something like this, but they are at least a little bit seasoned in terms of like college level study at that point. And it is a project that we work on. We're on kind of I guess most closely to like a quarter system. So our classes are 8 weeks long. So this is sort of a class that we work on training almost throughout the whole course. And then the last couple of weeks, they really work on their research and their editing.
Great. There's another question. Oh, sorry, Coach. Yeah.
Just quickly, it was wonderful to see Kristy. Students were fantastic and they were so engaged. And not only that, but beyond the course, I think one of your students remained active, continued. I don't remember his name, but I just thought that was just so amazing, because sometimes students, when you're working with students, and I mentioned librarians, we love working with professors and students as well. And again, it's just wonderful to see how engaged everyone is, and how, we expect to show up and make our pitch, and hopefully the students will be interested. But not only that, students, not only in Kristy's class, but elsewhere, really are very empowered sometimes to know that what they're studying and doing can be added into something that has long-lasting effects beyond the course. And obviously Wikipedia can be for the rest of your life. So it's also a really great to be a part, to see that happening as well.
Great, thanks everyone. I mean, we're coming to a close right now, so I'm just going to end this with the last question that we have from the Q&A, and of course people can continue to ask us questions on Slack. I'll put the links for some of the resources that I mentioned in my presentation on Slack as well. There is a question about claims and verifiability, I can't say that word, on Wikipedia, particularly clickbait headlines from reliable sources, and how Wikipedians can basically work with that. I have perhaps like a self-plug from the Wiki Credibility projects, where one of our grantees worked on an API basically with all of the reliable sources and most mentioned, I guess, citations on Wikipedia, where if you're a new editor, you don't really have to sort of go look for new information or citations yourself. There's sort of a visual editors that can help you as you're writing information about perhaps your hometown or a topic of your interest. Already established citations and sources that have been sort of checked are available for you to choose from, and links with your writing and claims in your article. But Pete, Jerry, if you have any thoughts about how to think about clickbait headlines, for instance, coming from reliable sources.
Jerry?
When you're going to Wikipedia, right, you're going to be, one of the things that's said is, and then I think it's been mentioned, is that during COVID-19, Wikipedia was one of the, was hailed as an area where you can get reliable information. Another thing that happened during the depth of the fake news, you know, on Twitter, et cetera, another time that Wikipedia was mentioned as a place that you can go to. So what I don't want to repeat what's already been said, but we can't use Wikipedia as your first source, for example. It's still, you know, a starting spot. You're going to go and you're going to see what's there in the bibliography at the bottom of the page, and you're going to get a sense of what's known information that's on there. And it's a good place to start. But one thing that is true, because of the stigma of the past, when everyone was saying, oh, you can't trust Wikipedia for this, that, and the third, 20 years on, there's been so much done to rectify that. In some cases, to over-rectify it, that you can at least know that there is a sense of the integrity of information being important, being valued, being hallowed, right? So, as you would for back to the encyclopedia reference, pardon the pun, you know, you wouldn't use an encyclopedia as your final source of information, but it's a good foundation of knowledge. So if you're, one of the reasons why News on Wiki and other projects that have been done through this this past year, it's happening is because, you know, there is effort to try to improve that that reliability, right? And you want to know where you can go for that foundation. So one thing News on Wiki does is that we're doing our part to try to ensure that at least the sources that you're going to for that information, that you have knowledge, educated knowledge, vetted knowledge about where that's coming from. And so you can use your own judgment as to whether that's something that you can do.
Great, thanks everyone. I mean, we've come to our hour mark, I guess. Like I said earlier, I am on Slack. I think Peter's also on Slack, sharing Slack. Yeah, so feel free to continue to engage with us there. We're on Twitter as well. Feel free to ask us questions on Twitter. I'm happy to answer more questions about the Wiki Credibility initiative, and I work at Hackers and the Credibility Coalition. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, and Pete, Sherry, Kristy, Ahmed, thank you all for the really great discussion. This is really interesting. For everyone else who wants to watch this again, if they missed anything, the recording will be on the LD4 YouTube channel. And thank you all for the really interesting information.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.